Do you remember the first time you ever covered FVR?
Actually, I got into Malacañang by siguro a twist of fate. The original reporter was covering Malacañang for ABC5 back in '92. Suddenly decided that he would not come in one day, and the desk asked me if I could take over. Um, so I said, okay. I never covered Malacanang before, and so I was pretty new to the beat. There are a few more senior reporters on the beat who were actually kind enough to show me the ropes, familiarize myself with the area. But meeting FVR for the first time, I remember I was a bit awestruck because I had only seen him previously in other news reports, having not covered him personally. And so, face to face with the man who helped bring about the EDSA revolution, was actually, a little bit intimidated as well. I didn't know exactly how I would be able to interact with somebody of his stature. So it took some time before I could get over the initial, maybe stage fright of talking to President Ramos and even asking him a question during one of the regular press conferences in Malacanang. So I can't remember exactly the first time that I asked him a question, but it was a press conference in Malacanang. And I
The
remember
regular?
a regular weekly press conference in Malacanang. I remember walking up to the mic. I was actually nervous that I would ask or maybe phrase the question in the wrong way. And I think I remember saying, prefacing the question with, Mr. President, I hope you don't find this impertinent. And then the president shot back right away and said, "That's okay, Tony. You're always impertinent." So I guess that put me in my place right away. But it was a funny moment, also to show that the president very good-naturedly would entertain questions, even though he found them a little bit irritating. But to my relief, he actually answered my question very directly.
And he called you by your first name.
Oh yeah, I think the president would never really resort to formalities whenever he directly interacted with us. He knew us by our first names, and he would always be very easygoing about talking to us. Of course, there would be times when he would be very defensive about issues, especially if they were very controversial. But he would never let that get in the way of a good personal relationship with any of us.
And he did do that, build a relationship, individual relationship with
I think
all
he,
of the members of the press corps.
I think he managed to do that because he always found time to at least bring in the reporters even to his home in Malacanang in Arlegui,
Arlegui.
and we'd actually even have time to drop by their rest house in Tagaytay. So in fact, it's like we were an extended part of FVR's family, the Malacanang Press Corps. Most of the time we'd interact with Mrs. Ramos. They'd be serving us refreshments, and in a sense, it was like FVR treated us as if we were, part of the Ramos brood, in a sense. We were pretty young at that time, so I
Yeah.
guess he also saw us as, maybe some way helping us, grow up in our profession, and he would actually help us by being more accessible, no? And also giving us siguro a look at the other side of FVR, not just as a president, but also as a person.
How did you take to that, Tony? That one he made the effort to establish a closer link between him and the individual members of, well, with you, for example, in particular.
Having not had the experience of covering a president, a living president before, my very first experience covering the presidency during the time of Fidel Ramos, I felt as if this was a leader who was not the type who would put a barrier between himself and the people that he was serving. In fact, I would thought that many officials would have been more aloof, that they would have been more protective of their image. But here was a man who was not afraid to let his hair down, so to speak. There are many moments that, he would not be afraid to laugh at himself. And he would joke around with us, share many light moments with us. And I thought that was very refreshing. It actually dismantled a lot of the stereotypes that I had expected of a government official. Somebody would be, stiff and very, how would they say, or who would be putting up, say, an image that wasn't real. But here was a man who actually showed a real side of himself as a person and even as a leader that I thought was very inspiring for most. And even for myself, I thought, now this is the kind of president that a lot of people would look up to. Not a lot of people would have thought that FVR, being a soldier, would have been that relaxed as a person. Because everybody would have thought, oh, here's a guy who did everything by the book, lakad militar, as they would say, and he'd probably not have time for any foolishness or nonsense. But FVR wasn't afraid to actually fool around a little bit, in the sense that he could be a good comic.
He
and that was
roughing it up, with the
oh
guys,
yeah, yeah. He liked a little bit of horseplay with the reporters, and it made the job a little easier for us, especially because lakad militar in the sense that we would start the day very early and end the day very late because of his demanding schedule. And we would always be on our toes because we'd be waiting for some new development coming out of the president's meetings, his activities. And having a way of personally interacting with the president back then and sharing light moments with him made the job more bearable and more enjoyable, actually. There are so many times that we thought that the 6 years that we covered FVR were occasionally spiced up by these light moments.
But was it also because of a purposive effort on his part to, a realization of the role media played, for example, in his presidency, for his governance, for his programs?
Well, I think FVR knew that the media coverage that he got was very important in achieving his own objectives. Of course, he wanted to, emphasize his vision for the Philippines, and that's something he kept on repeating his mantra over and over again. And of course, having covered FVR for the 6 years, it's always, it's like etched into your mind. Philippines 2000, kaya ba natin ito? All of these battle cries that FVR would make. And he knew that he would get that message across if he communicated well with the media. And that's why I think when he institutionalized that weekly press conference, it all the more gave him access to the public. The public would be able to hear about his policy pronouncements, would be able to understand how he was running the government.
And to hear it from him.
And actually to get it from the horse's mouth. That was very important. I think FVR knew how to communicate very well. And he also knew how to manage his messaging very well. Of course, maybe a lot of credit also should go to the staff who would be able to prepare all the background material for FVR.
Game changer yun, ano? That with regularity, diba? Each day, each week there was one afternoon set apart for a news conference. Diba?
Yeah.
So,
And not only that, because he was more accessible to the media, even though we were outside of the palace. Of course, in an official setting, in the Malacañang, where was it? The Heroes Hall, Ceremonial Hall. I kind of forget now. Well, inside Malacañang, where we held the regular press con, of course, there was a little bit more formality. But when we were outside covering FVR in one of his provincial visits, he'd be more relaxed. So we'd do ambush interviews with the president, and he'd still be willing to take on several questions regarding the top issues of the day. And that was also something we looked forward to, because once we got FVR talking outside of Malacañang, it was, I guess, in a sense, more of a free environment, freewheeling environment. It was less, I guess, constrained by the formalities of everything. So we actually got a lot more out of those ambush interviews.
oh, that was a nice one, you know. We'd wave him over and, you know.
No, actually, he'd be surrounded by the presidential security group, of course. But whenever he'd finish whatever activity he had for the day, he would saunter over to our group, would be waiting by the wayside, and then he would say, "O, pwede ba ako magpa-interview sa inyo?" So the funny thing is, siya pa yung nagtanong, "Pwede nyo ba ako interviewin?" So of course, that was his way of opening up, kung pwede kami magpa-ambush.
Yeah.
But we really appreciated it, that he took, he actually made the effort to open himself up to questions during provincial trips.
Okay. So, tell me about those assignments, Tony. The provincial trips. Some have described it as punishing, grueling, hectic.
Yeah, there are so many words that I can actually describe it, but I think one of the terms that I can use for it is sleep deprivation. Covering the provincial trips of President Ramos then required, the press corps most of the time to wake up maybe at 2 a.m., be at the Villamor Air Base maybe by 3 or 3:30 a.m., and board either a military helicopter or, at that time, one of the Fokker Air Force planes that was reserved for Malacañang Press Corps, and take off by first crack of light, maybe by 5:45, 6 a.m., be in some provincial venue by maybe 6:30 or 7 a.m., end the day maybe by about 5:30, 6 p.m., and then be back at Villamor Air Base maybe by around 8, 9, and still file stories, of course, because that was before the time of the internet, before we had cell phone, social media. So, yeah, these trips really demanded a lot of stamina and a lot of, I guess, focus, because you'd be fighting sleep. Sometimes you'd be skipping meals. And then, of course, you'd be so fatigued following the president around and wondering how he does it, and still gather information, do interviews, compose stories, and be able to dictate that back to the office. So, yeah, every trip presented a different set of challenges, especially if it were somewhere in Mindanao, where we would be taking long road trips after landing, and then we'd still have to take a land trip going somewhere. And so, every trip was an adventure. In fact, we had a running joke in Malacañang where we said, "Do you want to see the Philippines? Join the Malacañang Press Corps."
See the Philippines, di ba? Join the Malacañang Press Corps. Right. on its own, the challenges were daunting, no? But how did you get the stories back, Tony? Like
Yeah.
on a regular provincial trip, how many stories would you be able to generate, for example?
Well, of course, the president's events themselves would present some story possibilities,
Right.
but most of the stories that we'd be filing would actually be generated from the ambush interviews. So the big stories of the day that the desk would want us to follow up, then of course we'd have to get the president to comment on these issues. Of course, if there was a cabinet member who was in some way connected to that issue, then that would also be important for us to get. But once we got the information, of course, we'd be shooting interviews on tape. How to get the tapes back to Manila in time to air for the evening news. So it was always a mad rush to make sure that the president's convoy, or one of them, at least from either the RTVM staff, Radio TV Malacañang, or even our colleagues in PTV4, would be able to carry the tapes with them back onto the president's plane, have somebody in Villamor waiting, a motorcycle riding
The
courier,
couriers.
to rush the tapes back to our respective studios so that they could be edited. In the meantime, we would be scrambling to look for a phone or a fax machine where we could actually send our scripts back to the office. So a lot of people would probably find that very Jurassic, but that was the way it was done.
Right.
The process was much more slower, but we had to get our stories back to Manila. So you can imagine the flying time back to Manila from wherever, especially if it were Mindanao, would be about 2 hours.
Yeah.
And then transmitting the stories via fax, there was a long line of other reporters waiting to use the fax machine. So unahan yun. Wala namang away or riots that broke out just because we were lining up for fax machines. But in fact, it was very useful that the Office of the Press Secretary would always have an advance team and have fax machines set up in whatever venue. May press office lagi.
Working area, yeah.
That was, to me, I think, was one of the more efficient things during the Ramos administration, that they always had a press working area. They made sure that the covering media, the Malacanang Press Corps, had the facilities to transmit their stories. Otherwise, what was the point of covering the president if we couldn't get our stories back in time?
Timely, efficient manner, and getting it back. And I guess spreading the needed message.
Right.
you know,
The president,
at
of
the
course,
right time.
didn't want to waste the opportunity to present to the public what he had accomplished that day and what the administration's position was on several important issues. So he made sure that their press people would give us the ability to cover him and also to send the stories back to our station.
And you'd get back late in the evening.
And get up early again the next day
Do the
because
same thing.
the president would somehow set a schedule at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. Either he would have a meeting in Malacañang or he would be out again meeting with some local officials within Metro Manila. It was actually a very hectic time for the Malacañang Press Corps covering President Ramos. I think we aged 20 years covering 6 years of the president, because we actually spent most of that in Malacañang. So many of us matured on the job, I think, covering the president. We were all very young, but the 6 years actually made us significantly more mature, I think.
By the time you finished your, how do you call it, tour of duty?
Well, the tour of duty with FVR ended, but it was replaced by another tour of duty because there was another president, of course. But by that time, we felt that if we had survived 6 years of FVR, we'd survive 6 years of another president.
Or of another, no? Oh. Were there any, Tony, were there any do's and don'ts?
Well, don'ts. I don't remember exactly having any restrictions, or at least having or being mindful of any sensitivities that we might, somehow irritate the president or upset him by.
What he took any and all questions?
Oh, I think he was game all the time. He was very, I guess, open to being asked questions. In fact, if he didn't want to answer a question, he'd have a very sly way of getting around it. And say, if you asked him a question and he want to answer it, and say, okay, next question. So he actually just give you the brush off, but it was a funny way of brushing you off. It actually didn't mind. But if the reporter were persistent enough, he'd give you an answer, but not as direct as you would have wanted. As for the dues, I think the president really just wanted to be able to answer a question that was direct to the point. He would prefer it direct to the point, so that he could actually answer direct to the point as well. There were some occasions I remember that we were pressing him on an issue. I think it was, what was it about? I think it was about this this North Korean defector, if I remember right. That apparently it had been kept very confidential, very secret. Somebody had gotten wind of it and wanted to ask the president, but he sort of like brushed off the question. So later on, we found out that, in fact, I think it was the PSG that helped that North Korean defector pass through the Philippines on his way to, I think, to South Korea. So it was one of those moments that we felt that the president had deftly handled a very sensitive diplomatic issue, and he wanted to keep it quiet. So he knew not to give away too much information to the media.
He was very disarming, no?
Oh yeah,
He had a
lot
way
of
of
a lot of people, could find him, very charming, especially because he knew how to, make, light of some things. In fact, the thing that was very entertaining about FVR, there were some people who were like guests of the weekly press conference, and they'd be asking him some really amusing questions. So, FVR would sit there, would be grinning, not the slightest hint of irritation. But, we knew that it was probably a waste of his time to actually be confronted with those questions. But he took it there. He took it in stride.
Now that you mentioned the news, let me get back to that, the news conferences. Both in Malacañang and in the provinces, if you remember, Tony, so it wasn't just really an exclusive for Malacañang Press Corps members, right? There was foreign media, there were guests who had those really large press IDs on their chests. The same thing happened whenever there were press briefings in the provincial trips. And he gave national media, local media. There was always a small contingent of foreign agencies, the FOCAP that was attending. And again, the guests with the large IDs. And he gave equal time. He didn't favor one group over the other. How did that strike you? Weren't you feeling, this is the Malacañang press
So that we should actually have him all ourselves?
Right.
No. In fact, we welcomed our other colleagues, of course, with us who were, they'd be sharing the hardships with us because it's not as if they had an easier life than we had. They'd have to wake up just the same and travel the same distance and wait it out under the sun or the heat. We also appreciated it that the president welcomed other members of the media outside of the Malacanang press corps because we also had, well, a selfish motive for doing that because, some of these other reporters had their own sources and actually had access to other information that we otherwise might not have known that helped us give more depth to our coverage.
stories.
So, in fact, aside from the other guests with the big IDs, we really appreciated the fact that the president also had other members of the media come with us. It was a good sign for us that it was a very transparent administration, and in fact that he also wanted to project a good image to the outside world through the foreign media that was covering him, and I think he did succeed in doing so. Having members of the foreign press come with him on his trips to actually see how he inspired people on the ground, how he managed to effectively lead on the ground. I think that was important to him.
Again, I guess the appreciation of media's role, not just national, but the foreign media. Tantrums. Did you see any tantrums?
I don't think the president was the type who would openly vent. Although I know he would always take issue with news reports that he felt were inaccurate or somehow gave a misimpression of what he meant to say. His favorite technique to do so was to have a photocopy of a newspaper article that he wanted to correct or wanted to comment on. He would never show the masthead of that newspaper. He'd actually fold it so we wouldn't see what it was. But by the way the news article was laid out in the font that was used, you'd actually know whose newspaper it was. So it was very funny because he was trying to be, I guess, kind to the offending newspaper, but you'd still know what he was referring to. And he'd always take pains to explain, okay, this newspaper report got it wrong, or maybe this did not, emphasize what I wanted to say. So I think that was his way of, expressing his own irritation over things. But to actually say that he got upset, he'd show a flash of temper. No, he wasn't like that.
Wasn't like that.
So in fact, parang, I guess tama yung moniker niya na Steady Eddie. Because he was pretty level-headed and pretty calm most of the time. Hindi mo siya makikitang nagalit.
Even in the most trying of times.
Yeah. I think maybe the visible sign that he'd be a little upset was I think when he would be chomping on his cigar. You see the muscles in his jaw clenching. But that was it. He never raised his voice. He never snapped at anybody. He wasn't like that.
Out of curiosity, did you vote for him?
Oh, well, to be honest, I wasn't able to vote. 1992.
Oh, okay.
I wasn't able to vote. I think wala pang absentee voting noon.
You were overseas.
And no, I wasn't overseas. I was
You were
on duty.
Okay. Oo nga, no?
So early out on field, and I was registered, of course, in Quezon City, but I had to be covering him.
Never able to.
Where did he vote? I forget now. But no, I wasn't able.
Pangasinan.
I wasn't able to vote.
Oo nga, no?
Would I have voted? I should have voted.
Okay. Foreign trip assignments. You had a lot of those.
Yeah.
But you covered
I have
for.
a share.
Wait, let me clarify. You covered for which network at the time?
Initially, I was covering the Ramos presidency with ABC5. Midway into the president's term, I had transferred to ABS-CBN Channel 2.
Okay.
So I actually covered the Ramos presidency for two networks. So I was doing foreign assignments, first for ABC5 and then Channel 2.
Okay, tell me about the foreign assignments.
One thing about being on an overseas assignment and covering the president is either trying to adjust to the time differences,
Yeah.
being able to stay awake at a time when most of the people in the country you were in were already asleep because you were still sending stories back to Manila. So the challenges back then were, of course, it wasn't an internet age yet, and the only way you could send stories back on print was through a fax machine again.
Machine.
Email wasn't, I think, even that prevalent yet. And the problem with the video was actually solved through, the pool, the coverage pool that was always set up by RTVM. It was always a challenge for us not to get the assignments because they'd have a raffle of assignments.
Yep.
They'd have slips of paper where they would actually print out the president's daily schedule or hourly schedule. And if you picked out something that maybe wasn't that interesting, maybe just like,
Arrival honors.
or something, yeah. Well, arrival honors or something like that. But yeah, okay. So you'd hope that it would be something much more meatier
Like
that you could get, like maybe a meeting with the Prime Minister of Japan, maybe, or maybe a meeting with the UN President, or whatever, the UN Secretary General. So it was always a challenge not to get the least attractive assignment. So, but once you did get an assignment and you'd finish that, it'd always be a challenge to also be able to finish writing the report, edit the report, because RTVM would then have the challenge of transmitting the entire bulk of edited TV reports through a satellite station
right.
that PLDT would help arrange. And it was always a mad scramble to make sure that we'd be able to feed within the allotted satellite window. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any report to air. So covering the president at that time was a pretty hectic pace. In fact, there was only maybe a day before the president arrived that the press corps, the press pool, would arrive ahead just to give us time to adjust.
Right.
And it was a very short time for us to actually relax, maybe see the sights for a while. But once the president arrived, wala nang pahinga yun. We'd be up on our feet early morning, the rest of the day covering, extending until nighttime, writing stories, and maybe reporting live over the phone. But for the very few channels at the time who had the capability to report by satellite, of course, they'd have to be on cam. But it was interesting because, even during foreign assignments, the president would try to make himself available to the Malacanang press corps. He'd try to find time to go out of his way and meet us and talk to us, parang just to find out, how kamusta na kami, ganon, kumain na ba kayo, yung mga tipong ganon.
Drop by the press
drop by the
working
press,
area.
So we actually did find a lot of these foreign trips very educational in a sense, because we also had a taste of what it was like for a Philippine president to be able to interact with foreign leaders. To us, that was very enlightening because here was one aspect of the presidency that not a lot of people would be able to see. And we'd be able to see that up close, how he would comport himself meeting with his counterparts, how he'd actually be able to talk to businessmen and be able to sell the idea that the Philippines was a good place for them to invest. That was always something interesting to watch. Because to us, the president always prided himself as being the Philippines' greatest salesman.
Yeah, number one salesman.
Number one salesman. And to see him actually at work wooing and charming these investors and actually convincing them. To us, that was pretty interesting and also very enlightening.
Covering him, did you see the strategic view of what it was he was doing, the impact, scope of Philippines 2000, the importance of the bibingka, and that kind of thing,
Yeah.
with the jaded perspective of a grizzled newsman.
Yeah. Coming out from the turbulent years of the Cory administration, of course, you're faced with so many problems. Electricity shortages.
Nag-cover ka ba rin sa Malacañang nung Cory?
No, I
No.
wasn't in the
So
press
ano
corps
ka
yet. So I just actually entered Malacanang during Ramos's
FVR,
term.
okay.
Yeah. But coming out of the years where we practically didn't have any growth, practically didn't have any achievements, because we were so busy trying to stabilize the country during the core years. I could understand what FVR was trying to do, trying to get a sense of normalcy, stability, and consistency. I think it was key to his administration's success. And trying to find a way for people to become more productive. Kaya yung laging mantra ni FBR na yung may apoy sa ilalim, may apoy sa ibabaw, the bibingka principle that FBR always mentioned in any of his speeches or his interactions with local officials, always trying to drive home the point that if you don't empower the people, then the nation itself wouldn't be able to progress. So I saw his point there. Because wherever he went, he always tried to drive home the point that the local communities themselves, the provinces separately, should be able to harness yung people power nila. That they would be able to actually help in nation building, because yung mga probinsya would be, parang elevating, di ba, yung quality of life for their own people. And he wanted to do that, I think wisely enough, by trying to bring in more investors. Kasi alam niya na, syempre, the economy should be able to thrive, but without investments, hindi niya masusustain yan eh. I think he wanted to see Philippines 2000 nga parang as a way of parang setting a target na magkaroon na rin tayo ng mga siguro mga industries that could be self-sustaining, and he managed to do that. I'm sure, because there are a lot of investments that came in during the president's time that helped us to build siguro more roads, provide more jobs. In fact, I don't know if there was ever a period that people complained na mahirap ang buhay ng panahon ni FBR, because many of them were able to find jobs. The prices of goods weren't exorbitantly high, and he managed to stabilize everything. I mean, we had power. Nobody heard of a water shortage at that time. And most of all, I think people had the freedom to actually express themselves. I think that was one of the hallmarks of FVR's administration, was that people found a voice. They actually managed to have a say. Whether it was against or for the things that he was doing. What was important was that people realized that, yeah, I have a voice, I can say what I want, and without fear of persecution.
Yeah, 6 years. Was it too short? Well, they say too short for a
Too short for a good president.
man.
Too long for a bad
Too
president.
long for a
Yeah.
not too good president.
Yeah. 6 years. Well, FVR tried to amend the Constitution,
Pirma.
and
People's Initiative.
people started to think, maybe rightly or wrongly, that it was the wrong move for FBR to do so. In fact, when the protests started at the time that he was trying to get the People's Initiative rolling, I think he was taken aback. I think he was pretty surprised that there was this outpouring of, negative reactions from the public that he did not expect. He thought that it would have been welcomed more by people who saw that there should have been more continuity. If he was if he was doing a good thing, then we should just continue it, right? But the point came where he really felt that he was being unfairly judged. In fact, I think I remember him saying, "Why am I being demonized by trying to suggest that we should amend, the Constitution and maybe change the term limits?" For myself personally, it would have been probably a good idea if we had just run a plebiscite and asked people, would you want to change the term limits and allow an incumbent president to seek re-election? Then maybe that would have been more decisive instead of just holding protests, because we don't really know whether or not people had the inclination to actually see FBR stick around for another 6 years. And now we'll never know, because by the time FBR stepped down in 1998, we had actually just emerged from one of the
Financial
crisis, global financial crisis. So things took a downturn, but still, and then FBR left the country, I think, in a better shape than it was than when he took power in '92. If he had been given a chance, I think, to run for re-election, I guess, I'm just guessing, people might have given him a chance to be president again. Because I don't think people had any misgivings about the programs that he started, the programs that he actually implemented. There were some controversies, of course, along the way.
Well, he broke up a lot of those monopolies, the cartels,
Yeah, but there are also some controversies along the way.
tax. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, despite these controversies, I think people would have still considered FBR to be a good leader, a good manager. In fact, if they were comparing him to Mahathir of Malaysia, or even Lee Kuan Yew, some people were of the opinion that if we had allowed maybe a president like FBR to continue serving for more than just one term, then he would have had a chance to actually build on the accomplishments that he had in the 6 years. So it could have been a good idea if another 6 years were added to his term.
Any particular areas which stand out with you?
Let me see. Well, I would have to say, his having, I think, liberalized the economy was probably a turning point for the Philippines, in a sense that it actually helped to grow more industries within the Philippines. And in fact, well, you look at it on the other side, that the liberalization may have somehow weakened some of the native businesses, because there were larger companies that came in. But it also helped to expand the employment base. I think his liberalization policies actually did help. Many I think businesses now probably wouldn't exist if that step wasn't taken by his
During his
administration.
Okay. Okay. You've had the opportunity to meet up with him post presidency.
There were some occasions, social occasions, where I'd bump into him.
What are those meetings?
A birthday party of a former official of the Office of the Press Secretary. So he would regularly be at those events. He would never miss out on birthdays, especially of people that he worked with. So that was something, of course, that I also admired about him, because he would always take the time to remember these people who had served in his government. And he'd maintain very close ties with them. And also, when he'd meet us, once young reporters who covered his administration, and he would still remember all of us by name. I had him as a guest several times on my news programs on ANC. And the one thing that always struck me was that coming into the lobby, and he'd grip my hand. Wow, that was a strong handshake. I mean, for a guy his age, I mean, he can crush your hand with a handshake. So, yeah, I think I was pretty impressed that FVR would still keep in touch and still be able to, bat the breeze with us every now and then.
Friendship. There's a friendship that was developed then.
I can't say actually that I'm that close to FVR, because I sort of lost touch with him over the years. But yeah, in a sense, I think a bond between me and FVR that was formed during the days that I was covering him was there. It's always been there. I think the president knows that I admired him so much that I actually imitate his voice. Something that amused him and Mrs. Ramos to no end, especially when I had to play him in one of the gridiron presentations of the National Press Club.
Oh, but how did that imitation start? Was it one of those times we were waiting under the balete tree?
That was one of the occasions where, to pass the time, I would amuse myself and other members of the press corps by doing my impersonation of FVR. He has this sort of like nasal quality to his voice, and of course, his standard lines, which would easily be identified with him. So just to pass the time, I'd be cracking jokes, doing my FVR impersonations. And at the time, I didn't know that the National Press Club was going to put up the annual gridiron where they would roast the president and every member of the cabinet. So I was immediately the easy candidate to play FVR because they already heard my impersonations of FVR. In fact, my very first time that I exposed my FVR impersonation to the president and to the first lady was during a Christmas party inside the official residence in Arlegui.
Yeah.
So they asked me, and I think it was Al Pedroche of the Philippine Star who were co-emceeing the Christmas program. And I decided at that time that maybe the best way to have an icebreaker was to finally show President Ramos that I could imitate his voice. Before that, the atmosphere inside the Arlegui residence was so formal. You were so stiff, so quiet. And I decided, no, we should relax. So I took the mic, I think, from Al Pedroche, and I said I was going to reveal something to the President and to the First Lady, being Ramos. And they didn't know that I was going to say, so ito lang ang masasabi ko sa inyo. Thumbs up, everybody! So, Mrs. Ramos was so surprised. Lumaki yung mata niya. I said, tawa siya ng tawa. And then she turned to the President and then started slapping him on the arm. Because nagulat siya na sabi niya, parang cool mo. And then even the PSG started to laugh because parang sabi nila, oh my God, Ramos na Ramos. And then I started cracking jokes. Parang, because the President plays golf, right? And we were going to have a raffle because it's a Christmas party. What's a Christmas party without a raffle? So I said, tonight, I will be giving away several prizes. And one of them will be a signature golf ball with my autograph. But I just have one request from whoever will win it. Please don't hit my balls because it will be painful. Mrs. Ramos was beside herself with laughter, and I think that qualified me to be President Ramos for the gridiron presentation. And in fact, it was a very timely gridiron presentation because that was right after the health scare, the health crisis that FVR had. He had to undergo, months before that, emergency surgery for a carotid block. In fact, it was a life-threatening issue that the doctors immediately had FVR go under the knife to take out that block. And for a while, we didn't know whether or not the presidency had hung in the balance, So when he did get out of the surgery safely and he recovered, that became the theme of the gridiron presentation. How he survived that health crisis.
I'm fine. And Joseph Estrada was...
Yes, of course. That was the time when we thought that the constitutional line of succession would be put into effect. But of course, FVR lived to finish his term.
After all he's done and been through, Tony, does he remain relevant? Does he remain an influence to your view in Philippine society?
I have to say one of the biggest regrets that I would have in recent years is to see FVR's voice somehow being taken for granted, that his opinions have somehow been relegated to the sidelines. He could have been a good senior advisor to many presidents after him. In fact, he did serve that role even to Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo during her own crisis period. But in the later years, and especially during this administration, I think we would have benefited greatly from a voice of sobriety and a man of reason like FVR. But regrettably, I think FVR's experience and his own wisdom born out of experience is greatly unappreciated now. I don't think people would take kindly to criticism or even positive criticism from FVR. It would probably be misconstrued.
Oh.
But knowing FVR the way I did when I covered him, he would want all of the presidents who've come after him to succeed. Because he knows that it's not just their presidency that's at stake, but the future of this country. And what's disappointing to me is that for somebody of his stature who really, I believe, helped to build the Philippines in the 6 years that he was in power, that he was in office, that they're missing out on the opportunity to use his wisdom and use his experience to help them overcome many of the problems that they're facing now. So FVR's FVR as a spent force, unfortunately, may be true because people don't appreciate his depth of experience and the kind of insights that he could bring to meeting and maybe solving the problems that we have now.
That was his legacy.
Oh yeah, I mean there are many ideas that FVR presented during his time that if given a chance we could still have pursued them for another 6 years, then maybe we shouldn't be faced with this recurring cycle of problems every now and then. You know, we still have a shortage of classrooms every school season. We still have perennial flooding. We still have, you know, farms that are drying up because of lack of irrigation. And there are many things that should have been solved, you know, even during FBR's time that were being solved, were being addressed, but weren't continued. So, yeah, I think he is someone who was cast aside as just some historical figure, but should still have been very relevant to this day. That I believe.
Okay. I was going to ask if there is a special memory you have of FBR that always reminds you of him, but I'm going to assume that first gridiron spiel was it.
No.
No?
There are many memorable occasions with FBR.
Okay.
But here's one, and I don't know why it stuck to me. We were in Laguna, and I think it was at the inauguration of an industrial park. And for some reason, his front tooth fell off. I think he was wearing like a jacket on one of his teeth. It came loose and it fell off as he was on stage. And that was, for anyone, an embarrassing situation. But what he actually did was he used it to his advantage. He showed off his gap. And then he called all the photographers, "Oh, kunan nyo yung bungi ko." And of course the photographer started snapping away. And then the next day, a picture of FBR with that toothless, with that gap in his tooth showed up. And it was funny. I don't remember now what the big story of the day was, but I will always remember that event. Because it showed to me that the president, even though he's very serious about his work, did not take himself that seriously. And to me, that's the hallmark of a really great man, because if you don't take yourself seriously, then you know you can take anything. You can handle anything.
He was very confident with himself.
You know, you can laugh at him, you can laugh with him, but you can always make sure that whatever objective he set his mind to, he will deliver on it. No, hindi naman siya showbiz eh. Hindi siya showbiz, but he knew how to put people at ease whenever he needed to. And, you know, doing those things, parang hindi naman yung, kung ibang tao siguro yun, baka sinabi niya, cancel mo yung event kasi nabungi ako eh. Ito hindi. He went on with the event, kahit bungi siya, tapos ngiti pa siya ng ngiti.
Yeah.
I don't understand why he wanted to do it, but it was funny. And then he always wore these glasses na wala namang lens. Then you look at my glasses. They're see-through. Then he put his finger through the rim at wala nga salamin. So I don't understand, but you know, he has quirky humor. But yeah, those are the things that somehow the humorous experiences with FVR are the ones that stand out to me as well.
All right. You want to give him a message in your classic imitation?
No, I don't want to imitate the president. Just one FVR is enough. Mr. President, it was really an honor to actually be in the Malacanang press corps at the time when you were the occupant of Malacañang. In those days, I think my experience as a journalist expanded even more because of how you handled the issues and the situations that you found yourself in, that the administration had to cope with. In fact, I think the reason that I'm still a journalist now is because I went through 6 years of covering the Malacanang press corps, and it showed me how this country should have been run and should still be run. In fact, looking back at those years, I think it still allows me to hope that there are better things for this country if only we can find another leader like you.
Thank you very much, Tony.
Thank you.